My greedy husband and his ruthless mother tied me up and left me in a dark, freezing forest. Their chilling words still haunt me. This is the end for you.
Goodbye.
Your $100 million business is ours now. Helpless and unable to move, I thought it was over, until an old forest ranger miraculously saved me. But I wasn't just a victim. I returned with a plan they never saw coming, and a shocking revenge that left them speechless. My name is Samantha. I am 28 years old, a businesswoman based in New York City. I have always been ambitious, determined to build a successful career, and I thought my life was finally complete when I married Ethan, the man I believed was my soulmate. Ethan was charming, thoughtful, and supportive, or so I thought. I was drawn to his warm demeanor, and I believed we would build a life full of love and happiness. When we married, I moved into his family home. That's where I met Margaret, his mother. At first, I tried my best to connect with her. Margaret was a sharp, confident woman in her 50s who had raised Ethan as a single mother. I respected her for that and wanted to create a bond, but it quickly became clear that Margaret wasn't interested in any sort of relationship with me. She was controlling, dismissive of my opinions, and, most importantly, obsessed with money. It didn't take long before Margaret started demanding money from me. It began subtly, with small requests for help with groceries or bills. But soon, she insisted that I give her $4,000 every month for her personal expenses. It's only fair, she said, her tone making it sound like it was my duty as her son's wife. Ethan, to my surprise, supported her completely. She's done so much for me, Samantha. The least we can do is help her out. I didn't want to cause conflict, so I agreed. At the time, I told myself it was temporary, that she just needed help adjusting after Ethan and I got married. But months turned into years, and I realized Margaret's demands weren't temporary at all. She would call me at work to remind me of the payment due date. If I was late, she would sulk or make snide comments about how I wasn't a real part of the family. Ethan, meanwhile, became more distant. Whenever I brought up Margaret's demands or the stress they were putting on me, he brushed it off. "You're overthinking it," he'd say, as if I were the one being unreasonable. I started noticing little changes in him. He'd stay out late, refuse to discuss his whereabouts, and become defensive whenever I asked questions. The man I had fallen in love with seemed to be slipping away. The breaking point came 2 years into our marriage. One evening, I came home from work earlier than usual and heard voices coming from the living room. Margaret and Ethan were talking, their voices low but clear enough for me to hear. "We'll sell her car," Margaret said. "It's worth enough to cover the buy-in for the game." Ethan hesitated for a moment before replying, "Are you sure she won't notice? Samantha loves that car." "She doesn't have to know," Margaret snapped. "Just tell her it was stolen or something. It's not like she's going to call the cops on her own husband." I froze in the hallway, my heart pounding. My car, a sleek luxury vehicle I had saved for years to buy, was more than just a possession to me. It was a symbol of my independence, of everything I had worked for. Hearing them plot to sell it without my knowledge shattered something inside me. I didn't confront them that night. Instead, I started paying closer attention. I realized that the money I had been giving Margaret wasn't going toward her expenses at all. She and Ethan were using it to fuel their gambling habits. The realization left me feeling humiliated and betrayed. How could the people I trusted, my husband and his mother, lie to me so easily? Things escalated when I returned from a business trip a few weeks later and found my car missing. "Ethan," I asked, trying to keep my voice calm, "where's my car?" He exchanged a glance with Margaret, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Margaret said, "Oh, it must have been stolen. Such a shame, isn't it?" "Stolen," I repeated, my voice trembling. "Did you even call the police?" Ethan shrugged. "We didn't want to bother you while you were away." I knew they were lying. My hands shook as I demanded answers, and when they refused to admit the truth, I finally snapped. "You sold my car, didn't you?" I shouted. "You're nothing but thieves." Margaret's face twisted with anger. "How dare you speak to us like that?" she spat. "You've been nothing but a burden since the day you moved in." Before I could respond, Ethan grabbed my arm. "That's enough, Samantha. he said, his voice cold and unfamiliar. You need to calm down. But I couldn't. I was furious, hurt, and terrified all at once. The argument escalated until Ethan and Margaret did something I never thought they were capable of. Together, they overpowered me, tied my hands, and forced me into their car. My screams and pleas went unanswered as they drove me deep into the woods. When they finally stopped, they dragged me out and left me there, alone and terrified, before speeding off into the night. I lay on the cold forest floor, my body aching, my mind racing. How had my life come to this? Was this really the man I had married? And Margaret, how could a mother be so cruel? As I stared up at the dark sky, one thought burned in my mind. I would not let this be the end of my story. This betrayal wouldn't destroy me. It would only make me stronger. I lay in that cold, dark forest for what felt like hours. My wrists were raw from the ropes, and my body ached from being thrown out of the car, like I was nothing. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions, fear, anger, and disbelief. How could Ethan and Margaret do this to me? My husband, the man who promised to love and protect me, had left me for dead. I refused to give in to despair. Survival was my only focus. Summoning what strength I had, I managed to loosen the ropes binding my wrists. Once my hands were free, I sat up and scanned my surroundings. The forest was eerily quiet, the only sounds coming from the rustle of leaves and distant animal calls. I had no idea where I was, but I knew I couldn't stay there. After stumbling through the woods for what felt like an eternity, I saw a faint light in the distance. As I got closer, I realized it was coming from a small cabin. Relief washed over me, but I was still cautious. I knocked on the door, my hands trembling, and a man answered. He was tall, in his early 40s, with a rugged appearance that suggested he spent most of his time outdoors. "What happened to you?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. I need help," I said, barely able to get the words out. "They left me in the woods." "Come in," he said immediately, stepping aside to let me enter. "My name's Daniel. I'm a forest ranger. You're safe here." Daniel gave me water and a blanket as I told him what had happened. I didn't go into all the details, just enough for him to understand that my husband and his mother had done this to me. His expression hardened as I spoke. "No one has the right to treat you like that," he said firmly. "You don't deserve this." His kindness brought tears to my eyes. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt like someone genuinely cared. Daniel let me stay the night at his cabin, and the next morning, he drove me to a nearby town where I could contact someone I trusted. That person was my younger brother, Michael. Michael and I had always been close, and I knew I could count on him. When I called him and told him what had happened, he was furious. "I'm coming to get you right now," he said, his voice shaking with anger. "Don't worry, Sam. We'll fix this." True to his word, Michael arrived within hours and took me back to his apartment in Boston. He didn't bombard me with questions. He just made sure I was comfortable and safe. Over the next few days, as I recounted everything to him, the money Margaret had demanded, the gambling, the missing car, and how they left me in the woods, Michael listened quietly, his jaw clenched. "They're not going to get away with this," he said when I finished. "We're going to make them pay." Michael's words sparked something in me. For too long, I had let Ethan and Margaret control me, manipulate me, and take advantage of my kindness. But now, with Michael by my side, I felt a renewed sense of strength. It was time to take back my life. Michael and I started by hiring a private investigator. We needed proof, solid, undeniable evidence of Ethan and Margaret's crimes. The investigator worked quickly, uncovering financial records that showed where my money had gone. It was all there, thousands of dollars spent on gambling, with no trace of the so-called expenses Margaret had claimed. The investigator also found video footage of Ethan and Margaret at various casinos, laughing and drinking as they squandered my hard-earned money. As the evidence piled up, my anger grew. But I knew we couldn't act impulsively. Michael reminded me to be patient, that we needed to have everything in place before confronting them. While the investigator worked, I decided to take matters into my own hands as well. I reached out to people who knew Ethan and Margaret, neighbors, acquaintances, even a few of Ethan's colleagues. Some of them had witnessed their gambling habits firsthand, but had never thought to intervene. One of Ethan's coworkers even admitted that Ethan had borrowed money from him to cover gambling debts. It wasn't just about gathering evidence. It was about building a case strong enough to ensure they couldn't worm their way out of it. I wasn't going to leave any stone unturned. As the weeks passed, I started to feel more like myself again. I was still angry and hurt, but I was channeling those emotions into something productive. Michael was my rock through it all, always there to support me and remind me of why I was fighting. "You deserve better than this, Sam," he would say. "And you're going to get it." The final piece of the puzzle came when the investigator uncovered the sale of my car. The documentation showed that Ethan had signed the paperwork, with Margaret listed as a witness. They had sold it to a private buyer for a fraction of its value, just to get quick cash for a poker game. When I saw the proof, I felt a mix of rage and satisfaction. They had lied to my face, stolen from me, and left me for dead. But now, I had everything I needed to bring them down. It was time to take the next step. Michael and I compiled all the evidence and contacted the police. When we handed over the files, the officer reviewing the case looked stunned. "This is serious," he said. "We'll start the investigation immediately." As we left the station, I felt a sense of relief. For the first time in months, I felt like justice was within reach. But I also knew this was just the beginning. Ethan and Margaret had underestimated me, but they were about to learn that I wasn't someone they could betray and walk away from. The day Michael and I filed the police report marked the beginning of a new chapter in my fight. It wasn't just about what Ethan and Margaret had done to me. It was about standing up for myself, reclaiming my dignity, and ensuring they were held accountable. But even with the police now involved, I knew I had to stay strong and see this through. Over the next few weeks, the police conducted their investigation. They reviewed the evidence we had provided, the financial records, the videos of Ethan and Margaret gambling, and the documents proving the sale of my car. They also interviewed people who had witnessed their behavior. Each piece of evidence added weight to the case, making it harder for Ethan and Margaret to deny their actions. One morning, I got a call from the lead detective handling my case. "Samantha," he said, "we're ready to move forward. We have enough evidence to make arrests." Hearing those words sent a wave of relief through me, but it was mixed with anxiety. I couldn't predict how Ethan and Margaret would react when they realized their game was up. Still, I knew this was the only way to finally free myself from their control. The arrests happened quietly. The police waited until Ethan and Margaret were at home before knocking on their door. I wasn't there to see it, but I later learned that Margaret tried to talk her way out of it, claiming there had been some sort of mistake. Ethan, on the other hand, looked shocked and confused, as if he couldn't believe this was happening. The news of their arrests spread quickly, and I started receiving calls from people who had known them. Some expressed disbelief, while others admitted they had always suspected something was wrong. It was strange to hear the sympathy in their voices after everything I had been through, but I appreciated their support nonetheless. Once Ethan and Margaret were in custody, the next step was the trial. Preparing for it was one of the most challenging parts of this journey. My lawyer walked me through the process, explaining what to expect and how to present my side of the story. I had to relive every painful detail, the lies, the theft, and the moment they left me in the forest. It was emotionally exhausting, but I reminded myself that this was necessary to ensure justice. On the day of the trial, I felt a mix of nerves and determination. I walked into the courtroom with Michael by my side, feeling his reassuring presence. Ethan and Margaret were already there, sitting with their lawyer. Ethan wouldn't look at me, but Margaret's gaze was cold and defiant, as if she still believed she could manipulate her way out of this. The prosecution presented the evidence we had gathered. The financial records were laid out for the court to see, showing how my money had been drained to fund their gambling habits. The investigators' report detailed the sale of my car, with Ethan's signature as undeniable proof. Video footage of Ethan and Margaret at various casinos played on a screen, their carefree smiles a stark contrast to the pain they had caused me. When it was my turn to testify, I felt the weight of everyone's eyes on me. I took a deep breath and began to speak, telling the court about my experience in my own words. I explained how Margaret had manipulated me into giving her money, how Ethan had supported her every demand, and how their betrayal had escalated to the point of leaving me for dead. I trusted them, I said, my voice steady despite the lump in my throat. I trusted my husband, and I tried to respect his mother. But they saw me as nothing more than a source of money, someone they could use and discard when I was no longer convenient. As I spoke, I saw Ethan shift uncomfortably in his seat. Margaret's expression didn't change, but I could tell she was furious. She had always been confident in her ability to control others, and now she was losing that power. The defense tried to argue that the situation had been exaggerated, that there was no proof they had left me in the forest intentionally. But their arguments fell flat in the face of the overwhelming evidence. Witnesses testified about their gambling habits, and even Ethan's coworker spoke about the money Ethan had borrowed. When the judge announced the verdict, I felt like I was holding my breath. Ethan and Margaret were found guilty on multiple charges, including theft, fraud, and reckless endangerment. The judge didn't hold back in his sentencing, emphasizing the harm they had caused and their lack of remorse. As they were led away in handcuffs, I felt a sense of closure. This wasn't just a victory in the legal sense, it was a personal victory. For too long, I had let their betrayal define me, but now, I was free to move forward with my life. Michael hugged me as we left the courtroom. "You did it, Sam," he said. "It's over." I nodded, feeling tears well up in my eyes. It was over. The people who had tried to destroy me were finally being held accountable, and I could start rebuilding my life. The courtroom was silent as the judge's gavel struck, signaling the end of Ethan and Margaret's reign of deceit. Watching them being led away in handcuffs felt surreal. For the first time in years, I wasn't weighed down by fear or manipulation. Justice had been served, and I was finally free. As Michael and I walked out of the courthouse, I felt a sense of calm I hadn't experienced in years. But it wasn't just relief, it was empowerment. I had fought for myself, stood up to the people who had betrayed me, and emerged stronger. "Are you okay, Sam?" Michael asked as we got into his car. I nodded, smiling for the first time in what felt like forever. "I'm more than okay. I feel like I can finally breathe." Over the next few weeks, I began to rebuild my life. With Ethan and Margaret in prison, I no longer had to endure their demands or their lies. But the emotional wounds they left behind would take time to heal. I started therapy to process everything I had been through, and it helped me rediscover parts of myself that I thought I had lost. I realized that their betrayal didn't define me. It was a chapter in my life, but not the whole story. Michael continued to be my biggest supporter. He offered me a place to stay in Boston while I figured out my next steps. I was hesitant at first. I had always been fiercely independent, and relying on others didn't come naturally to me. But Michael reminded me that it was okay to lean on people who truly cared. "Sam, you're not alone in this," he said one evening as we sat in his living room. "You've always been there for me. Let me be here for you now." With his encouragement, I started to feel more confident about the future. I decided to leave New York City behind, along with all the painful memories it held. Boston offered a fresh start, a chance to redefine myself and my goals. One of the first things I did was buy a new car, not as extravagant as the one I had lost, but it symbolized my freedom and independence. Driving it for the first time felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. I also threw myself into my work. My business had always been a source of pride, and now it became a source of healing. Pouring my energy into my career helped me regain my sense of purpose and reminded me of my own strength and resilience. I even expanded my network in Boston, connecting with like-minded professionals who inspired me to keep pushing forward. Despite the progress I was making, there were moments when the past still haunted me. Sometimes, I'd wake up in the middle of the night, my heart racing as I relived the moment Ethan and Margaret left me in the forest. But each time, I reminded myself that I was no longer that helpless woman. I had taken control of my life, and I wasn't going to let their actions hold me back. One day, I received a letter from Ethan. It came from the prison where he was serving his sentence. My hands trembled as I opened it, unsure of what to expect. In the letter, Ethan apologized for everything he had done. He claimed that he had been manipulated by Margaret, that he hadn't realized the extent of the harm he was causing. For a moment, I felt a pang of sadness. This was the man I had once loved, the man I had believed in. But as I read his words, I realized that his apology didn't change anything. He had made his choices, and those choices had consequences. I didn't owe him forgiveness. I didn't respond to the letter. Instead, I focused on the life I was building. I joined support groups where I connected with others who had experienced betrayal and toxic relationships. Hearing their stories reminded me that I wasn't alone, and it inspired me to share my own journey. I wanted others to know that they, too, could overcome even the darkest of times. As the months passed, I found myself smiling more often. I started going out with friends, exploring Boston, and rediscovering the joys of life. I even began dating again, cautiously, but with an open heart. I wasn't looking for a fairy tale, just someone who would treat me with the kindness and respect I deserved. One evening, Michael and I were sitting on his balcony, watching the city lights. "You've come a long way, Sam," he said, raising his glass in a toast. "I'm proud of you." "Thank you," I said, clinking my glass with his. "I couldn't have done it without you." As I sat there, surrounded by love and support, I realized how far I had come. The betrayal that had once shattered me no longer defined me. I had reclaimed my life, my independence, and my happiness. Ethan and Margaret's actions had tested me, but they hadn't broken me. This was my story, a story of betrayal, revenge, and triumph. But most importantly, it was a story of resilience and hope. I had learned that even in the darkest moments, there is always a way forward. And now, as I looked out at the world, I was ready for whatever came next.